Welcome back to our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. We're so glad you're joining us again with Marshall and myself and Luke as we continue to walk through this book of wisdom, this book of contemplation of life and the meaning of life. And we're getting closer and closer to that sort of final conclusion as he looks across everything that he said up to this point. Next week, we're going to be drawing that to a conclusion. But I think as we look into these last few chapters, looking into chapters 9 and 10, we're going to see that we're already closing in on those conclusions, that we see more and more mention of what is beyond the sun, though we're still contemplating and contrasting that notion of what's beyond the sun to what is under the sun. So we're going to continue looking at those things tonight. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Luke to lead us in a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for allowing us to come together and study your word once more. We thank you so much for giving us an opportunity with every breath to serve you, to look to you, to think about you. We ask that you please help us all to turn our minds fully and wholly to your word this hour and try to give us open hearts and an open mind as we study through it, try to make application in our own lives. Help us to not be hard-hearted. Help us to truly listen and honestly ask questions of ourselves when we see them in your word. Help us to go through your word readily and with an open heart that we might just try to learn from it. We ask you please forgive us of all of our sins. Help us to be thankful for all the blessings that we have, but ultimately for the blessing of your Son, who was that perfect and ultimate sacrifice. And we ask forgiveness through him. It's in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Marshall, why don't you start us off there in chapter 9?
All right. So as we begin here, we look at what
Chapter 8, sorry.
Yeah. So as we're here in Ecclesiastes and we're starting in chapter 8, we're going to make our way through chapter 10. We've noticed in previous studies that wisdom has been a key theme, but now it's really coming to a head as he discusses wisdom. And here in chapter 8, verses 1 through 9, what we're going to note is that, yes, wisdom is good, but sin and sinners can corrupt everything. And so what's the answer to that? Well, the best answer we have under the sun is wisdom. And I want us to look at three major concepts associated with wisdom in this section. And that is, number one, that it is transformative. Number two, that it is respectful. And number three, that it is patient. And some of these themes that we look at are going to continue through into the other sections as well. But let's just begin by reading chapter 8 and verse number 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse number 1. If you have a Bible with you, I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible. Who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illumines him and causes his stern face to beam. And so we have this repetition of the word wise and wisdom, and knowledge is thrown in there as well. And this seems to serve as kind of an introduction to what he's going to be discussing. And it also seems to indicate that there is a rarity. It's unique to find someone who is associated with wisdom, and yet the benefits far outweigh the consequences of that kind of wisdom. And so as we think about this idea of wisdom, number one, being transformative, note that it will change you. It will help you through this life, and it will make you what you are supposed to be. It reminds me of the statement in Romans chapter 12 and verse number 2 that says that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds so we can prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And so in a New Testament context, there is definitely a renewal of the mind that needs to occur. And that is somewhat in contrast, though it works together with the dedication of the body in verse number 1. We're giving ourselves as living sacrifices. And that involves letting God change us from the inside out. And wisdom, at least the wisdom of God, is that which is going to really make us what we need to be and help us move forward. Now, does the writer of Ecclesiastes have that full picture of wisdom that we have in Jesus as the personification of wisdom? I don't know if he's there yet in Revelation, the revelation of God, but he still understands there's something unique about wisdom that will help you to move forward in this life. Jesus is, in fact, the very wisdom of God that leads to sanctification, that leads to a change of life. And even in his limited picture in the Old Testament, the writer of Ecclesiastes sees that. And I think we see that in experience, just as Solomon did as well. That experience shows us that wisdom leads to a better life here, most of the time. Not always, and we'll see some of those exceptions in Luke's section, but for the most part, being wise is the better way than being a fool. And he then kind of extrapolates this point and moves forward with it by saying, not only is it going to change you, it's going to brighten your face, as it were, it's also going to be respectful. It's going to change your interaction with others. And so if we're still in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, read with me verses 2 through 4. I say, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave him. Do not join in an evil matter, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since the word of the king is authoritative, who will say to him, what are you doing? And so in this short section, what we note is that wisdom is going to lead to a change in how you interact with those in positions of authority. Now, some might look at this and say, well, that's pretty self-serving of Solomon. He's saying, if you're a wise person, you're going to obey the king. But as we continue throughout this section, chapters 8 through 10, we're going to see that he's not saying that the king is necessarily one deserving of being followed because of his own character, but it's because of his authority that you need to follow him. And wisdom recognizes the life lived in wisdom is a life lived in respect for the authority that God has placed in this world. That's about all I'll say on that, so I don't step on to other people's sections. But this is this is extended in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Wish we had time to read through all of those. Maybe someone else is going to this evening. And as we honor the king, that is showing good behavior, so that's going to influence others and help them to see what the Christian life is all about. It doesn't mean that we just walk along with foolish and sinful practices, but we serve God first. But then under the authority of God, we serve others who are in this world. And Stephen's going to talk some more about that in just a moment. But then the third idea about wisdom is kind of categorizing it and then getting ready for the specifics later on, is that wisdom is patient. If you look with me in verses 5 through 9, he says, he who keeps a royal command and experiences no trouble, for a wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every delight, though a man's trouble is heavy upon him. If no one knows what will happen, who can tell him when it will happen? No man has the authority to restrain the wind with the wind, or authority over the day of death. And there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. All this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt. Now we see some echoes of previous sections of Ecclesiastes here, where he says there's an appropriate time, that there is a time for everything. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And then especially in verses 16 and 17 of that same chapter, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 16 and 17 says, furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. And so there seems to be somewhat of a repetition, somewhat of an echo of the earlier sections where he's investigating things. Now he's coming to some conclusions. And what he says here is a life well lived, a wise life will say, these are the people God has placed in authority. As I am serving the Lord, I'm going to obey their commands as best I can. I'm going to look for what God is doing here. I'm going to wait for his providence and know that he is going to right every wrong at the end, at the day of judgment. And wisdom helps us to live that kind of life. You know, if we're just living in folly and in rebellion, we're just going to go into anarchy, and there's going to probably be punishment, or there at least is going to be negative consequences associated with that. And so he says, here's what wisdom does. Wisdom respects. Wisdom is patient. And that is how you can have a transformed life here and now, is knowing that wisdom will show you the better way Even whenever there is injustice, even when there is folly all around us, wisdom shows a better way. So does wisdom prevent all evil? No, but it certainly helps. And Luke and Stephen are going to take us through the next sections, which will help us show that point even more. So, Luke, I think you're next.
Yes, sir. And wisdom absolutely does help, and we're going to see through this next passage, starting in verse 10 of chapter 8, in some aspects what Solomon means by this, where maybe wisdom lacks in a sense. But in verse 10 of chapter 8, he continues by saying, "So then, I have seen the wicked buried, those who used to go in and out from the holy place, and they are soon forgotten in the city where they did thus. This too is futility. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. Although a sinner does evil 100 times and may lengthen his life, still I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear him openly. But it will not be well for the evil man, and he will not lengthen his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God. There is futility which is done on the earth. That is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. On the other hand, there are evil men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I say that this too is futility. So I commended pleasure, for there is nothing good for a man under the sun except to eat and to drink and be merry, and this will stand by him in his toils throughout the days of his life which God has given him under the sun. When I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night, and I saw every work of God, I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. For I have taken all this to my heart and explain it, that righteous men, wise men, and their deeds are in the hand of God. Man does not know whether it will be love or hatred. Anything awaits him. It is the same for all. There is one fate for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good, for the clean, and for the unclean, for the man who offers a sacrifice and for the one who does not sacrifice. As the good man is, so is the sinner. As the swearer is, so is the one who is afraid to swear. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that there is one fate for all men. Furthermore, the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil, and insanity is in their hearts throughout their lives. Afterwards they go to the dead. For whoever is joined with all the living, there is hope. Surely a live dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know they will die, but the dead do not know anything, nor have they any longer a reward, for their memory is forgotten. And indeed their love, their hate, and their zeal have already perished, and they will no longer have a share in all that is done under the sun. Now that's a bit of a lengthy passage, but as we go through, what you kind of see is Solomon go somewhat back and forth. He goes through several truths that wisdom would show you, and that we see every day, and you have to kind of take them all at once. But what I want to do is just go through a few of the points that he makes in this section that we just read. And one of the points, as we were talking about just a moment ago with wisdom, is that wisdom is definitely beneficial and it's definitely worth it. But there is a sense in which wisdom lacks, because one place, at least, where you see wisdom at least seem to lack is where you see that the righteous get what the wicked deserve, and vice versa, when you see the wicked get what the righteous deserve. And generally we look at the world and we want it to be the other way around. We want the righteous to receive the reward, and we want the wicked to receive punishment and judgment and the penalty. But let me just ask you, is that what you see every day? And so as we look at the world and we see these things, wisdom can't really reason why this occurs, because really when you look through the Proverbs before this, and you see what the Proverbs say about this, how the wicked, the rule is the wicked are punished, and judgment comes to those who are unrighteous and evil and don't have God on their hearts. That is the rule. And this still plagues us today, that as we look out to the world and see several examples, because we don't see immediate justice hit the wicked and the unrighteous and the evil. I think because we don't see that immediate justice, people are driven more to do wrong, since well, nothing's really going to happen. There's almost a sense in which, because we don't see it every single day, that rule play out every single time. We think, well, if I don't see it here, then that means it's never going to happen. And certainly that's not the route, that's not the logical route to take, because what we're talking about is the rule. When what we see, and even what we see often, is the exception, when the wicked prosper instead of find punishment. And this is, as we talked about a few studies ago in Psalm 73, something that a righteous, godly man questions himself, and he wonders why he has almost stumbled. He wonders why he is going through some things that he thinks the wicked should go through, and he wonders why the evil are fat and sleek, and while they are prosperous. We're all tempted in this way, but ultimately, wisdom may not be able to sort this problem out on the face of it, but it does still point to the fact that wickedness isn't the answer. It at least points to the fact that wickedness, again, as the rule, almost speeds up the punishment in a sense. But still, what we see is constant examples of people not getting that immediate justice. Wisdom reminds us rather that this unfortunate occurrence is just the exception. And with that being said, along those lines, he also reminds us that while you may, with wisdom, gain more understanding of this life, you will never be able to know it all, or you will never be able to decipher it all, because God has not revealed it all. And I think that there's a deep lesson that lies within that as well, as we read through that section that we were just reading through, because God indeed has not revealed it all. We are not meant to know everything. What we're meant to do is rely on him as our source of knowledge. What we're meant to do is make him our focus. And if you're looking for the answer, well, here it is. It's God. And Solomon really constantly comes back to this point, that if you're looking for the answer, you're not going to find it under the sun. And all these things, even though you're looking for understanding, you're not going to be able to find that answer unless you look to God. He is the answer. And so, again, God has put us in a situation where we cannot know except by looking to him. Only God knows truly everything, and he has given us what we need to know to live in this world and to live through this life. But then ultimately, as he comes to the end, after all is said and done, death comes to all. And that means for both the righteous and the unrighteous, death awaits us. And you talk about the questions that come from seeing the wicked not being punished, but rather prospering. You just talk about that. You get to even more futility when you realize ultimately, no matter who you are, we're all arriving at death at some point, no matter what, and no matter who you are. All of this, again, I say that Solomon kind of repetitively comes back to this point, comes back to the point of God, and that you want the answer. Here is God. He comes back to it once again, that all of this points to God's control and God having full knowledge. Therefore, what we find is that he is the ultimate answer, and that serving him is the best in the end. And so therefore, serve him and look to him, because we won't be able to figure it all out. But with all that being said, as Solomon continues on, he gives us a little bit of wisdom on how we are to live, and Stephen's going to get into that.
Yeah, so as we pick up there in verse 12 of Ecclesiastes chapter 9, we get some interesting advice here in the midst of all of this sort of dour observations up to this point. And really just think about it all the way from chapter 1 to now. Solomon has not generally been making observations that are encouraging or uplifting. So many of them are discouraging observations. And so when you look out in the world and you see injustice, when you see, as Luke has been talking about, the good suffering, the wicked prospering, what is the response? I don't know about you, but I think as we look around and people become aware, maybe more aware of injustices occurring, more aware than they have been. There's people who wake up or get woke to injustices that are happening either in our country or around the world. And what is the response? Well, very often the sort of suggested response is that we need to be miserable about those things. Now, there's a suggestion that you need to go out there and change the world. And so that there is at least some sense of trying to do something to change it. Now, one of the things that Solomon has observed all through this is that your capability, your capacity to change worldwide problems is very limited. Even Solomon himself was very limited in his capacity to do anything about that. And so our capacity is going to be limited. But I think that there's a sense in which the world says, well, at least you could be upset about it. You know, at least you could go around and hang your face low and mope and don't go out and enjoy anything about life if there are other people who are suffering in this life. Solomon has a very different approach here. Beginning in verse 7, it says, "Go then and eat your bread in happiness and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works. Let your clothes be white all the time, and let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given you under the sun. For this is your reward in life, and in your toil in which you have labored under the sun." He says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going. Again, I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors. And neither is the bread to the wise, nor the wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability. For time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, man does not know his time, like fish caught in a treacherous net, and birds trapped in a snare. So the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls on them." As you read through that, particularly those first few verses, 7 through 9, that idea of enjoyment, to eat your bread in happiness, to drink your wine with a cheerful heart. And he says, God has already approved of your works. I think as you walk through these elements, the eating and drinking, the clothes of white. Now, these would be, I think, contrasting to what we've looked at, the mourner's clothes, right? You've got the sobriety, the sadness, that's what the world counsels, is put on your black garments, walk around, mourning with the rest of us. And there's a sense in which there's an appropriateness to that. To be sure, he talks about the value of the house of mourning. But here, almost in contrast, he says, put on your white clothes, put oil on your head. Don't walk around with a sad face and gloom all the time. Enjoy, he says, life with the woman who you love all the days of your fleeting life. And so all of these things are aspects of enjoyment. And don't let all the difficulties in the world say to you that you are not allowed to have any enjoyment in your life. No, rather, he says, you do what is good, what is right, what is approved by God, and then you can have some confidence in the enjoyment that you get from this life. You don't have to go around feeling that sort of guilt at the enjoyment that you get from this life. I don't know about you, but growing up, your parents try all sorts of things to get you to eat your food. And so when you dislike a certain food, they might say, do you know that there are kids in, name a deprived nation, who would love to eat the things that you're turning down right now? Now, my response to that would be, I'll be happy to ship it to them, right? I didn't want to eat this anyway. I'd love for them to have it. But of course, the idea is to make you feel guilty for turning down anything. And I think to some degree, we kind of take that on into adulthood, that if we're having some simple pleasure, some simple enjoyment, there's nothing wrong in and of itself. But don't you know people are suffering? I do. And I care. And I will, if I'm able, as much as I have opportunity, as Galatians chapter 6 would point out, I will do good to those who are round about me, but I can't save the world. And God says, you're not the one who needs to carry that weight on your shoulders. You go about, eat your bread and enjoy that. Drink your wine and enjoy that. You have work to do. You have a wife to enjoy at home. Wear clothes that express the joy. Put the oil on your head that expresses that refreshment. Enjoy the simple things of life, we might say. Now, he's not talking about extravagances. He is talking about simple joys, not to pursue those tremendous exaltations of pleasures that he described earlier in the book, where there is vanity, to put that pursuit to sacrifice righteousness in order to pursue pleasure. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the kind of things that God approves of. I would look over at Colossians chapter 2. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul is preaching against an asceticism. He's preaching against people who would find holiness by depriving themselves, and really then preach that others ought to do the same. And he says, these are matters, this is verse 23, these are matters which have, to be short, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body. There's an appearance. You know, when you see somebody who goes around in sackcloth and ashes, that there can be a sense of, oh, wow, doesn't he look holy? They have that appearance. But he says they're not of any real value against fleshly indulgence. That's not going to do the trick. In fact, the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy about a very similar, notion, and then gives a more thorough answer. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, it says that that the Spirit explicitly says that in later times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons by means of hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron. Men who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. And then he says this, for everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with gratitude, for it is sanctified by means of the word of God and prayer. Sometimes we wonder why we say a prayer every time we sit down to eat. It's to remind us that this thing is good in so much as we recognize it as a gift of God. And I think as we're coming toward the end of this book, we're seeing that the reason you can enjoy these simple pleasures is because they are sanctified by that notion. That's what makes them not vain. If I think of those simple and good pleasures as reminders of the giver of all good blessings, as reminders of a time where I will be able to spend with him for all eternity, enjoying pleasure, enjoying the pleasure of his presence, the satisfaction that, of never being hungry again and never being tired. When I enjoy those simple pleasures, if they remind me and draw me towards God, well, then they're profitable, they're fruitful, they're helpful. And denying ourselves of those pleasures, of the very things God created for us to enjoy, is not helpful. That's not the answer. The answer to sort of hedonistic pleasure pursuing is not don't pursue pleasure or don't enjoy pleasure, but it is to enjoy it in a wholesome way that recognizes that it comes from God. And so I think that's what he's counseling here. You can't take on the burdens of the whole world. And so don't feel guilty when you haven't fixed the world and yet you are having a little bit of enjoyment in your life. I would add to that he speaks of this toil here. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. We are very limited in our abilities, and sometimes we might get frustrated because we can't do all of the things. We're so limited in our capacity. And so, what's the answer? The answer isn't to give up. The answer isn't to pursue it in futility as if you could do all of the things. The answer is do your best. Put your hand to it. And at the end of the day, be able to say, I did what I could, and be satisfied with that. You see, there's where we get outside of that cycle and that sort of despair of saying, at the end of the day, and feeling so helpless and meaningless. Did you do what you could? Yes. Fair enough. Be satisfied, be content with that. as Paul again would counsel Timothy a little bit later in that same letter in chapter 6, that contentment with godliness is great gain. I really think the idea here is not that he promotes pleasure, but really promotes contentment with the simple joys that God has given us. Well, finally, in verse 12, he says, moreover, man does not know his time, and like a fish caught in a treacherous net and birds trapped in a snare, so the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. Do all of this because you don't know when it's all over. Don't think in your mind that I'll deprive myself of all these simple joys now and I'll have them later. He says, look, enjoy them now. You don't know about tomorrow. How many times have we wished that we had embraced someone, that we had taken advantage of opportunities to enjoy simple pleasures before they were gone, and especially when it comes to people, as he turns us towards our family here and talks about the wife of our youth. As someone has said, no one on their deathbed ever says, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. So very often people wish they had spent more time cultivating the simplicity of life, the simple enjoyment of life, instead of continually putting that off while they pursued the very vain sorts of things that Solomon has already talked about here. So pursue, or rather enjoy and be content with the simple pleasures, and take them in now while you have the opportunity, for that opportunity is fleeting. Well, then we come to verse 13, and we pick up again with the theme of wisdom and the comparison to folly. And so Marshall's going to take us through that section.
All right. So as we're going to be looking at a section 9:13 through 10:7, as you can see on the screen, and we're going to divide it up into two major sections. And I want to start off with a quote from Albert Barnes, and he's not necessarily my go-to guy for commentaries, but I just happened to see his comments on this section. I thought there was some wisdom to it. He said, wisdom, in contrast to folly, is the best remedy in the present life to the evil of vanity. And so this kind of brings everything together. Solomon has been looking at this world, and he says, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, and all this pursuit and all this gain. He says, it's just futile, or it's fleeting. And Barnes kind of hits it there by saying wisdom is the best case scenario. It's the best remedy we have under the sun. And with that in mind, I want to look at these two illustrations, as it were. Solomon talks about a wise man delivering a city. Then he goes through some proverbs to talk about the error of folly. And bringing this together, it will help us to see that this is just as true today as it was back then. So let's read chapter 9, verses 13 through 18 to begin with, and then we'll pause there. Ecclesiastes 9, 13 through 18. Also this I came to see is wisdom under the sun, and it impressed me. There was a small city with few men in it, and a great king came to it, surrounded it, and constructed large siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he delivered the city by his wisdom. Yet no one remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength. But the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. The words of the wise heard in quietness are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Now, we really could continue because this chapter break is somewhat unfortunate, but as we look at this theme of the man delivering a city in a military conflict, it really highlights one major point, is that wisdom can deliver, but it is often despised. Wisdom can deliver, but it is often despised. We kind of see that in modern political context, and I'm not saying for one party or the other, but often votes are cast based on celebrity status rather than someone's actual knowledge and wisdom about the situation in this world. And so in this scenario that Solomon paints, and I don't know that he's talking about a real historical situation or if he's looking at it in a broad sense that I've seen something like this, but regardless whether there was an actual city he saw delivered or whether he's drawing up an illustration, a parable, as it were, the truth is there that because this man is not of status, he is not respected and he is not remembered. Even though he, through wisdom, delivered this city, there's no monument for that poor man. And so while wisdom did help that city, the wise man is not remembered. He is not lauded for the good that he did. And that's sometimes what happens under the sun, right? Is that good things are done by wise people. And yet, because it does not fit the norm, or it does not fit the world's standard of what is good and what is right and what is wise, then that person is forgotten. And yet he says wisdom is still better. There is a sense in which wisdom is stronger than swords. It is able to move a people in the right direction if that wisdom is heeded. And yet you get the theme that is going to pick up and be exemplified even more in chapter 10, that folly is what most people actually follow. And that is so unfortunate, and it's so real. We see that all around us. And so let's pick up in our reading in chapter 10, verses 1 through 7. This really continues with the better than Proverbs, as it were. But he says, dead flies make a perfumer's oil stink, so a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart directs him towards the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position, because composure allays great offenses. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, like an error which goes forth from the ruler. Folly is set in many exalted places, while rich men sit in humble places. I have seen slaves riding on horses, and princes walking like slaves on the land. And as we've talked about in previous studies, Ecclesiastes kind of gives you the other side of the coin from Proverbs, whereas Proverbs is more wisdom lauding, and it is showing the honor and the positive things that can come from wisdom. Ecclesiastes says, let's put a little bit of real world mix in this, that sometimes things just don't work out the way they should, that the wise and the wealthy and the socially exalted are going to wind up being humbled. And not because they're necessarily bad people, but because they are simply not respected by the fools that are around them. And so as we think about chapter 10, verses 1 through 7, we see a couple of illustrations, a couple of proverbs to show just how terrible the influence of sin and folly can be in the world. And he first talks about dead flies. This could also be translated flies of death or death flies. And so some have said that this is a venomous or poisonous fly that would emit an even worse odor if it found its way into perfume. But whatever animal he might be talking about, we see the point, don't we? It's just one little insect can ruin the perfume. So a little bit of folly can ruin the wisdom of many people. Furthermore, he talks about the left and the right. And I don't think he's talking about just the metaphor of going off to the left and going off to the right, because you could look back in the Pentateuch and you're not supposed to go left or right. But he says the wise one is able to go to the right and the fool is going to go to the left. I think he's talking about in this culture where left-handedness might be looked down upon. Ehud in the time of the judges is somewhat an oddity, and so that's what allows him to be successful in his military escapade. But the right hand was associated with power. It's associated with honor. It's associated with skill. And in this sense, the wise person, they have wisdom at the ready, and they're able to use it effectively, while the fool in general is going to be confused, is going to be broken, is not going to know what they ought to do. He builds that point even more when he talks about the confusion of the fool, doesn't know where he's supposed to go. He's like one walking down the road and doesn't have the destination in mind and gets lost and doesn't know where he should be. And so wisdom and folly are here contrasted in such a way that you can really dig into the imagery, and you can see that folly ruins so much. Whereas wisdom could deliver the city, folly can bring it down. Whereas wisdom could exalt a nation, folly is going to lead it into a cycle of rebellion and sin. And he even brings up leaders, as it were, the rulers and foolish leaders, those prone to temper tantrums, if you will. But in essence, and I'm going to leave that section for Stephen as he moves into 16 through 20. But the idea here is wisdom is good, but it may not be respected. Folly is bad and exalted. And so while wisdom is rare, he's trying to make the point it is helpful. It's the best remedy, as Barnes says, for life under the sun. Folly is common. It is hurtful. But the implicit command behind these illustrations is, therefore, if you've got to live under the sun, it's better to choose wisdom than folly. Wisdom is going to lead to greater success. And even if you are despised, even if you are forgotten, it's going to lead you in the right direction toward, as I think he said throughout the book, to fearing God. That's the wise course of action, is to know who God is and know our relationship to him. But he doesn't get explicit with that, and we'll talk about that more as we move through on to the end of the book. But as we move from this idea of the contrast between wisdom and folly, he does show that there are some added benefits and give some specifics. So I'm going to turn it over to Luke to kind of lead us through the next section on the benefits of wisdom.
Yeah, and maybe kind of continuing on in what Marshall was just talking about, you see some of the practical applications of the success that wisdom kind of just gives way to, in contrast to folly, which may give way to ruin. And so we'll continue on in verse 8 of Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And he says, "He who digs a pit may fall into it, and a serpent may bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits logs may be endangered by them. If the axe is dull and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. Wisdom has the advantage of giving success. If the serpent bites before being charmed, there's no profit for the charmer. Words from the mouth of a wise man are gracious, while the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of his talking is folly, and the end of it is wicked madness. Yet the fool multiplies words. No man knows what will happen, and who can tell him what will come after him? The toil of a fool so wearies him that he does not even know how to go to a city." So, again, this, as you read through that, this really just seems pretty much like common sense as you look through this very, I think, practical examples that he gives. But I think we can all see the temptation in what we see here. In just, let's just get the job done. Let's just get it done, and really the temptation of just thoughtlessness or a rash carelessness. What you see with wisdom is that wisdom motivates you to take precautions when you do a job, and you take them before you start the job, not afterward, because afterward it's too late. As he says about the serpent which bites before being charmed, there's no more profit for the charmer because you've already been bitten. And so that's why you premeditate and you think beforehand. That's what wisdom would have you do, so that way it won't be too late. And I think this is a great lesson when it comes to this futile life as we live through it, because it's hard for us to look ahead in general. It's very hard for us to just stop for a moment and just think. As I said just a minute ago, we just want to get things done. We want to get them out of the way and not have to worry about them anymore. But there is great wisdom in thoughtful planning in how you're going to proceed with a job, with a certain prospect. And he uses the example of sharpening the axe, and you can just, I just envision looking at the comics in the newspaper. You just see that split grid there of, on one hand, you have the man who sharpened the axe, who gets it done in, let's say 2 hours. And then on the other hand, you have the man who doesn't sharpen the axe, and he gets it done in 8 hours. And so you can kind of see the contrast between the two. Wisdom would have you sharpen the axe so that you don't exert more strength, as it says in verse 10, and wisdom has the advantage of giving success. Now, it could be, as we're talking about this, it could be just stupid laziness as to just not thinking things through. But generally, I really do think that it's just just a carelessness or a thoughtlessness when it comes to how to proceed. I mean, when I was younger, I had to mow 1 acre. Our front yard and backyard, it all encompassed 1 acre, and we had to mow it. Luckily, we had a riding mower. Well, generally, me being a teenager, I don't really think about anything other than just getting the yard mowed, because I want to get back in and maybe, play a video game, whatever. I don't want to be doing this. I don't want to be doing the work. Now, I think many people can kind of relate to that. I don't really want to do this right now. And so we just want to get it done. Now, afterwards, one day I had mowed the lawn and it was very patchy and spotty, and there were spots where the grass just didn't cut as well. And what it came down to was the blade needed to be replaced. And what I had to do was I had to get all of those patches that didn't cut right, and I had to bring them down to the level that the rest of the grass was. And really, it was even more unfortunate because I didn't get to mow with the riding mower. I had to take a weed eater and go throughout all that, because you couldn't mix the lines. The lines had to be just right. And so really, I don't think that was just me being foolish. I don't think that was just me saying I know what I should do, that I need to think about replacing a blade. But I didn't think about that. It was just that you're so focused on getting the job done, and we don't really want to take the time to think ahead. Now, after that time, I always remembered maybe checking the blade underneath the deck before getting on the riding mower and turning it on. I always remembered there's a blade that's sitting right there that we have sharpened already. Maybe it would just be better just to take a look. And so, again, I don't think that it's just people that are just actively trying to just do the foolish thing, but we just don't think about it often. And so I think there's a great lesson in making a point here, in make sure you do think about it. Be active in thinking ahead, because I really think that generally that's something we have a problem with. As you read through this section, another thing you learn along those lines is that, in a sense, if you don't think ahead, you'll have thought too late. And you see that with some of the examples we've talked about. And especially in life, you see this, and really spiritually. And I think that this is a lesson that really needs to hit deep as we think about that thought of too late. When we could have from the beginning determined to do it the right way, determined with the knowledge that we have from the Bible, moving forward, how to proceed. Often we just, like I said, we don't do that. And really what we do when we're not thinking ahead spiritually, what we're doing is either making it much harder for us to get back where we need to be, or we will get to the end and it will be too late. And so there's, I think, a deep and impactful point that should be made as we think about looking ahead eternally. Because ultimately, as we said before in some previous sections, death awaits us all. And we need to be thinking ahead to that moment, because no matter who you are, it's waiting and it's ready for you. But also, in addition to that, you go to from verse 11 to verse 12, and Solomon gets into some description of the wise and the fool, really, I think, focusing on the words or the lips of the foolish and the wise. In verse 12, he says, words from the mouth of a wise man are gracious, while the lips of a fool consume him. And then you kind of see a progression where you find that the words of a fool, it doesn't just stop there, it progresses and it gets worse and worse. In verse 14, he says, the fool multiplies words, no man knows what will happen, and who can tell him, or rather, in verse 13, he's continuing from verse 12. He says, the beginning of his talking is folly, and the end of it is wicked madness. And so again, I think there is some connection in that we're talking about wisdom and how that gives way to success. And then you think about foolishness. And certainly when you think about the descriptions of the wise and the fool throughout the wisdom literature, often it is the fool who speaks without thinking. It is the fool who speaks way more than he should, and with much more words than he should. And so you have that description in your mind as you read through this. And so in verse 10, you see wisdom gives way to success, while foolishness, and maybe as we've been talking about, thoughtlessness or carelessness, gives way to tragedy. And so you have the description of the fool and the progression from his words to that outcome in verse 13 of wicked madness. And so you can definitely see some of those practical lessons that you can learn from from wisdom and folly. But as we conclude tonight, Stephen's going to take us through the end of the chapter. in continuing on.
So looking at 16 through 20, these last 5 verses, what we have here, just as we had looking at the section where Solomon is telling us to enjoy some aspects, that's kind of a practical application. What does all this mean? Well, enjoy the things you eat, enjoy the things you drink. And now there's some practical application, again, from some of the things that we've been looking at, this idea of leaders and so forth. And he brings it down again to some sort of distilled thoughts on that subject. So as you pick up there in verse 16, he says this, he says, woe to you, O land, whose king is a lad and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, whose king is of nobility, whose princes eat at the proper time, or at the appropriate time, for strength and not for drunkenness. There's a couple of considerations here at the beginning here of this thought process. And that is, first of all, you would rather have leadership that is competent and self-controlled rather than leadership that is inexperienced. The idea of having a child, some of your translations will say servant, but I think the idea of a lad here is an appropriate translation here. And especially as you compare those 2 verses of 16 and 17. But the idea of the lad who feasts in the morning, he's a child, he doesn't have the control to wait to eat at the appropriate time. And so he doesn't have either experience or self-control. And then you contrast that with the older king, who incidentally is surrounded by council, surrounded by princes, and then who waits and eats at the appropriate time. And notice he says, for strength rather than drunkenness. He doesn't eat just for pleasure. He eats because you have to. I think there's several things to make note of there. First of all, we certainly, well, always, you see a constant battle in culture throughout history of old versus young. And the idea of age is not that age automatically carries wisdom. Certainly there can be folly in old age, but there is, just by virtue of comparison, there ought to always be some level of deference that is paid to age. And I think particularly right now in our society, there's a lot of mockery that goes on of old age, and lots of phrases that are used to dismiss old age. When people say, okay, boomer, what they're doing is saying, I don't have to hear whatever it is that you're saying. Solomon says, we want experience. We don't want youth in leadership. And there's tragedy that comes along with that. Can there be wise, youthful leaders? Yes, there can be. We see Josiah is a good example in the divided kingdom. It's one of the best kings that the southern kingdom ever has. And so, yes, it's possible to have good leadership in youth, but that would be the exception. That generally speaking, you want the maturity and you want the self-control. Well, the other thing that I would note about that is what he says here about those who eat for strength and not drunkenness. Kind of balancing and maybe contrasting a little bit with what we said earlier about enjoying that simplicity, enjoying the bread, enjoying the wine. There is some enjoyment that we gain from eating. But I think here the idea is that there are people who lead with the mentality of getting what they can out of it, not for giving justice and doing their duty and then enjoying their meal at the end of the day as part of refreshing themselves after a hard day's work, you might say, but rather just they will take their enjoyment first. And if they must, if it's sort of like the unrighteous judge that Jesus talks about, if you beat on their door long enough, maybe you'll get something out of them. I think that we can view life that way. It's not just leadership, but sometimes we can view life as getting our pleasure at the front end, and then maybe we'll do our duty before the day is over if we must. So that's the leadership strategies or processes that are contrasted there. He goes on to talk about the irresponsible leadership through indolence, he says, laziness, the rafters sag, and through slackness, the house leaks. Men prepare a meal for enjoyment, and wine makes life merry, and money is the answer to everything. I just can't help but think as I read through that, the idea that things are not taken care of, things are let go as problems continue to increase. They are put off for another generation, and the leaks get worse, and the problems grow. And what is the answer? Well, money will fix it all. We'll just throw some more money. We'll just spend more, and that'll fix everything. And so that's the mentality here, that there is not a diligence, there's not a thoughtfulness among the leadership. And so again, he sort of shows what happens when we don't take care, when we're not thoughtful and wise, comparing and contrasting these leadership strategies. But then he says this in verse 20, furthermore, in your bedchamber do not curse a king, and in your sleeping rooms do not curse a rich man. For a bird of the heavens will carry the sound, and the winged creature will make the matter known. What do you do when you see irresponsible, profligate leadership, where they do pass on the problems to another generation, where they constantly think that money is the answer to all the problems? Well, what you do is you be real careful. And you don't think that justifies you blaspheming the leadership, saying wicked things about the leadership, cursing the king, and not just the king, but he says rich people. I'm glad that we don't have a problem with cursing people in power and rich people in this country, right? No, I think it's the national pastime now. And then I think there's a great irony in saying a bird of the heavens, maybe the bird of the Twitter, will take your comments and they will make them known. Not only are people not careful about not cursing the king and the rich in their bedroom, they're not careful about cursing him in front of the whole world. Solomon says here, this is not good. This is not appropriate. That even when we have incompetency in the leadership, that our response ought to be respect. That our response ought to be a recognition that that's who's in power. I think about that from the standpoint of what Paul has to say over in Romans chapter 13, as well as what Peter counsels in his epistle to Jewish Christians. In Romans chapter 13, the familiar passage there in verses 1-7, he says with regards to the authority that they exist and are established by God in verse 1. And so don't resist them. He says, if you resist those authorities, you resist God. He says rulers are not a cause for fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to not live in fear? Do what is good. You will have praise from the same. It is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. Because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing, rendered to all what is due them, to tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Paul is writing that unequivocal command to yield and show deference to governing authorities at a time when some of the greatest tyrants in history were on the throne, emperors of Rome, who were careless of Christians particularly and practiced great injustices, were utterly profligate in their usage of taxes, absolutely characterize the kind of leadership that Solomon describes there in the latter portion of Ecclesiastes 10. And under that leadership, and in the very heart of that leadership, Paul writes to Christians and says, give them their due, show them the honor, and move on with your life. And I think Solomon says, yes, this leader is better than that leader. Obviously, what are you going to do about it? Show them the honor and move on. And so I think, boy, if anything could be applicable about that to us today, that certainly should hit home for us. Well, that brings us to the close of chapter 10. We're going to be picking up in chapter 11 and 12. Marshall, why don't you give us a little bit of a preview of that?
Sure. So in chapter 11, what we're going to note is that you have kind of a follow-up theme of wisdom, and that there's always a little bit of risk involved with any venture in this life, and yet wisdom can kind of help you diversify your assets a little bit and move in the right direction. But then he begins to contrast youth and old age. And he says for the old, they need to remember. For the youth, they need to remember something else. So you have a remembrance theme, but all of it's pointing to the big conclusion that we've been working toward in the entire book of Ecclesiastes. What is the purpose of man? What is man all about? And many of you already know it, but that's what we'll look at next week. How do you piece this all together, this under the sun mentality? Well, it's by keeping a proper perspective about this life and about God. So we'll talk about that next week. We'll finish out the book and then move on from there. Were there any questions or comments on you all's end? All right. I think we're good here. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week, Lord willing. And we hope you'll continue with us even beyond that. We have some things in mind, and Stephen's going to tell us about that next week, I'm sure. But ultimately, this is about learning more about what God's will is for us, and we hope that Ecclesiastes is helping you as much as it's helping us. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.